My name is Amanda Clark, and at 25, I made the hardest decision of my life. I packed everything I owned into my beat-up Honda Civic and drove away from Millbrook, the small town where I'd spent every day of my existence, leaving behind my family's struggling hardware store and the siblings who called me selfish for pursuing my dreams. For 8 years, they made it clear that I had abandoned them, that I cared more about my career than family loyalty. They stopped inviting me to holidays, excluded me from family decisions, and treated me like a stranger whenever I visited. But when their world came crashing down and they faced losing everything our grandfather had built, suddenly I wasn't selfish anymore. Suddenly, my success in the corporate world was their salvation, and the sister they had written off became their only hope. But before I tell you how I handled their desperate pleas for rescue, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Because this is a story about the price of following your dreams and what happens when family loyalty becomes a one-way street. Growing up in Millbrook, Nebraska, population 3,847, meant everyone knew your business, your family history, and exactly what your future would look like. My grandfather, Thomas Clark, had founded Clark Hardware in 1952, and it had been the cornerstone of Main Street ever since. The red brick building with its creaky wooden floors and endless aisles of nails, screws, and farm equipment was more than a business, it was the heart of our family's identity. Dad took over from Grandpa Thomas when I was 12, running the store with the same steady reliability that had made it a community institution for decades. Mom worked the front counter, greeting customers by name and keeping track of store credit for farmers between harvests. It was a comfortable, predictable life that provided for our family and served our neighbors well. I was the youngest of 4 Clark children, with a significant age gap that often made me feel like an only child. My oldest brother, Robert, was 8 years older than me and had been groomed to take over the hardware store since he could count change. He was steady, practical, and completely content with the idea of spending his entire life within 5 miles of where he was born. My sister Sarah, 6 years older, had married her high school sweetheart and settled into life as a stay-at-home mom and part-time bookkeeper for the family business. She lived in a modest ranch house 3 blocks from the store and seemed genuinely happy with her routine of school pickup, church committees, and family dinners. My brother Michael, 4 years older, had briefly considered leaving Millbrook for college but ultimately stayed to help with the store's expansion into farm equipment sales. He was charismatic and well-liked, the kind of person who could sell anything to anyone and made friends wherever he went. And then there was me, the baby of the family, born when my parents thought they were done having children. From my earliest memories, I was different from my siblings in ways that became more pronounced as I grew older. While they were content with the rhythm of small-town life, I felt restless, curious about the world beyond Millbrook's borders. I loved reading about distant places, different cultures, and business innovations happening in cities I could barely imagine. When my high school guidance counselor suggested I consider applying to colleges outside Nebraska, my siblings reacted as if I had announced plans to join a circus. "Why would you want to leave?" Sarah asked during one family dinner when I mentioned looking at schools in Denver or Kansas City. "Everything you need is right here." "College is expensive," Robert added pragmatically. "And for what? You can learn business by working in the store. Real-world experience is worth more than classroom theory." Michael tried a different approach. "Besides, Amanda, the store needs fresh thinking. You could bring new ideas to the family business, help us modernize and grow." Their arguments were well-intentioned, but they didn't understand the feeling that grew stronger every day, that I was meant for something beyond the comfortable limitations of Millbrook. It wasn't that I didn't love my family or appreciate the life they had built, I simply couldn't shake the conviction that there was a bigger world out there waiting for me to explore it. The tension came to a head during my senior year of high school when I received a partial scholarship to the University of Colorado's business program. The offer was substantial but still required significant additional funding, money that my family would have to sacrifice to provide. "It's a wonderful opportunity," Mom said carefully when I showed her the acceptance letter, "but honey, we need to be realistic about what we can afford." Dad was more direct. "Amanda, that scholarship is nice, but it's not enough to cover everything. We'd have to take out loans, maybe even mortgage the store." "Is that really fair to the rest of the family?" The implicit message was clear. Pursuing my dreams would come at the expense of my family's financial security and my siblings' inheritance. Robert was characteristically blunt in his assessment. "You're being selfish, Amanda. This family has invested everything in the hardware store. That business supports all of us, and now you want us to risk it so you can get a fancy degree you don't need." "I'm not asking you to risk anything," I protested. "I can take out student loans, work part-time, find a way to make it work without burdening the family." Sarah looked at me with disappointment. "It's not just about money, Amanda, it's about priorities. Family should come first. The store needs you here, especially as Mom and Dad get older." "What about what I need?" I asked, frustration finally boiling over. "What if staying here isn't what's best for me?" The question created an uncomfortable silence around the dinner table. Michael finally broke the tension with what he probably thought was a compromise. "Look, you can always go to college later, maybe take night classes at the community college in Lincoln. But right now, the family needs you. Don't you think you owe us that loyalty?" The weight of their expectations and the guilt they were placing on my shoulders was crushing. I loved my family deeply, but I also knew that if I didn't take this opportunity, I might never have another chance to discover what I was truly capable of. That night, I called my grandmother on my father's side, the only family member who had ever encouraged my ambitions. Grandma Helen lived in Omaha and had always been different from the rest of the Clark family, more worldly and independent. "Sweetheart," she said after I explained my dilemma, "you only get one life to live. You can spend it meeting other people's expectations, or you can spend it discovering your own potential. The choice is yours, but choose wisely, because you'll have to live with the consequences either way." "But what if they're right?" I asked. "What if I am being selfish?" "There's a difference between being selfish and being responsible for your own happiness," she replied. "Your family's disappointment will fade, but your regret at not trying could last forever." The conversation with Grandma Helen gave me the courage to make a decision that would change everything. I accepted the scholarship to the University of Colorado and took out student loans to cover the remaining costs. I would work multiple part-time jobs if necessary, but I was going to college. The announcement created the biggest family crisis of my young life. Dad was hurt that I hadn't discussed the decision with him first. Mom cried, worried about me being so far from home. Robert accused me of abandoning my responsibilities. Sarah said I was breaking up the family. Michael tried to convince me to defer for a year and reconsider. "You're making a mistake that will affect all of us," Robert said during our final family meeting about my college plans. "When you're struggling with debt and can't find a job with that degree, don't expect us to bail you out. And don't expect to waltz back here and take over the family business after you've rejected it," Sarah added. "We'll be fine without you." Their words hurt more than I had expected, but they also strengthened my resolve. If they could so easily write me off for pursuing education and opportunity, then maybe my instincts about needing to leave were correct. The going-away party they threw for me was awkward and subdued, more like a funeral than a celebration. Neighbors and family friends offered polite congratulations mixed with thinly veiled criticism about young people who thought they were too good for their hometowns. "College is fine," said Mrs. Peterson, who had known me since birth, "but there's no place like home, you'll see." Pastor Williams, who had watched me grow up in his congregation, was more direct. "Education is valuable, Amanda, but wisdom comes from understanding your place in God's plan. Sometimes that place is right where you started." The implication was clear. I was being prideful and foolish, abandoning my God-given role in the family and community. On the morning I left for Boulder, only Mom and Dad came out to see me off. My siblings had found excuses to be elsewhere, their absence a clear statement about their feelings regarding my departure. "Call us when you get there," Mom said, hugging me tightly, "and remember, if it doesn't work out, you always have a home here." Dad's embrace was stiff and brief. "Be smart with money," he said, "and don't forget where you came from." As I drove out of Millbrook that August morning, watching my hometown disappear in the rearview mirror, I felt a mixture of excitement and heartbreak that would stay with me for years. I was finally free to pursue my dreams, but the cost had been higher than I had anticipated. College life in Boulder was everything I had hoped it would be and more challenging than I had imagined. The academic workload was intense, the social dynamics were complex, and the financial pressure was constant. I worked 20 hours a week at a campus bookstore, took out maximum student loans, and survived on ramen noodles and determination. But I also thrived in ways that would have been impossible in Millbrook. My business classes opened my mind to concepts and strategies that excited me. I studied marketing, finance, operations management, and organizational behavior with professors who had worked for major corporations and international consulting firms. My classmates came from diverse backgrounds and brought perspectives I had never encountered. Some were from wealthy families and had traveled the world. Others were first-generation college students like me, working multiple jobs to afford their education. The conversations in dormitory lounges and study groups broadened my understanding of what was possible in life. During my sophomore year, I landed an internship with a Denver-based marketing firm that specialized in helping small businesses develop their brand strategies. The work was fascinating, combining analytical thinking with creative problem-solving in ways that energized me. My supervisor, Jennifer Martinez, became an unofficial mentor who saw potential in me that I hadn't recognized in myself. "You have a natural understanding of how businesses operate," she told me during my performance review. "But more importantly, you understand people. That combination is rare and valuable." She encouraged me to consider graduate school and eventually a career in business consulting. "Companies pay substantial fees for the kind of insights you develop naturally," she explained. "You could build a very successful career helping businesses solve complex problems." The possibility had never occurred to me, but as Jennifer described the consulting world, I realized she was outlining exactly the kind of career I wanted: challenging, diverse, well-compensated, and respected. Communication with my family during college was sporadic and increasingly strained. Our weekly phone calls became monthly, then quarterly. When I shared news about my internship or academic achievements, the response was polite but unenthusiastic. "That's nice, dear," Mom would say when I told her about making the dean's list. "How are you eating? Are you getting enough sleep?" My siblings rarely came to the phone during these calls, and when they did, the conversations were awkward and brief. "Still playing corporate person?" Michael asked during one particularly uncomfortable call. "When are you coming home for a real visit?" "I'll try to make it home for Christmas," I replied, though the thought of returning to Millbrook's judgment and disappointment filled me with dread. "Try?" Sarah's voice was sharp with hurt. "We're your family, Amanda. We should be a priority, not something you fit in when it's convenient." The guilt trips were constant but subtle, designed to make me feel selfish for building a life that didn't revolve around their needs and expectations. My first Christmas break visit home was a disaster. Everything in Millbrook seemed smaller, more limited than I remembered. The conversations were repetitive, focused on local gossip and family updates that felt insignificant compared to the complex business challenges I was studying. More troubling was my family's obvious resentment toward the changes they perceived in me. My vocabulary had expanded through academic study and professional exposure. My clothes were more polished, reflecting internship dress codes and campus fashion. My interests had broadened beyond the narrow scope of small-town concerns. "Listen to her," Robert said mockingly when I mentioned an interesting case study from my international business class. 2 years of college and she thinks she's smarter than everyone else. "I don't think I'm smarter," I protested. "I'm just sharing something I learned." "Right," Sarah chimed in, "because we're just simple, small-town folks who couldn't possibly understand your sophisticated college education." The contempt in their voices was devastating. I had hoped that my academic success would make them proud, but instead, it seemed to confirm their worst assumptions about my character and motivations. Dad tried to bridge the divide by asking about my future plans. "So when you graduate, you'll move back home and help modernize the store?" The assumption that my education was somehow preparation for returning to the family business revealed how little they understood about my goals and aspirations. "Actually," I said carefully, "I'm planning to pursue a career in business consulting. There are opportunities in Denver and other cities that could be very rewarding." The silence that followed was deafening. "Other cities," Mom repeated quietly. "How far away are you planning to go?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "I want to explore my options and see where the best opportunities are." Robert's face hardened with anger. So this whole college thing was just an excuse to abandon the family permanently. "It's not about abandoning anyone," I tried to explain. "It's about building a career that uses my education and abilities." "Your abilities," Michael said with disgust. "What about your obligations? What about the sacrifices this family made to help you get that education?" The accusation was unfair but effective. They were rewriting history to suggest that they had supported my college decision when the reality was that they had opposed it every step of the way. The visit deteriorated from there, with daily arguments about my priorities, my ingratitude, and my supposed arrogance. By the time I returned to Boulder for spring semester, I felt emotionally battered and more convinced than ever that leaving Millbrook had been the right decision. Junior and senior year passed in a blur of academic achievement and professional development. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration and a job offer from McKinsey Company, one of the world's most prestigious consulting firms. The offer was everything I had dreamed of: a substantial starting salary, comprehensive benefits, and the opportunity to work with major corporations on complex strategic challenges. The position was based in Chicago, putting me in the heart of American business culture. When I called home to share the news, the reaction was predictably mixed. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mom said, though I could hear the sadness in her voice. "Chicago is so far away, though. Will you be able to visit often?" "Consulting work involves a lot of travel," I explained. "I might not be home as frequently as I'd like." "Of course not," Robert's voice came through the speakerphone, "because your fancy career is more important than family." "That's not fair," I replied. "This is an incredible opportunity that could set up my entire career." "Set up your career doing what?" Sarah asked. "Telling other people how to run their businesses when you've never actually run one yourself?" Her dismissal of my chosen profession stung because it revealed how little they understood about what I had studied and what I hoped to accomplish. The conversation ended with stiff congratulations and vague promises to visit when possible. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my family's disappointment in my choices had hardened into resentment that might never fully heal. My first year at McKinsey was brutally challenging but incredibly rewarding. I worked 80-hour weeks on projects that took me to client sites across the country and internationally. I analyzed operational inefficiencies for manufacturing companies, developed growth strategies for retail chains, and helped technology firms navigate market expansion. The work was exactly what I had hoped for: intellectually stimulating, professionally respected, and financially rewarding. My starting salary was more than my father made running the hardware store, and the performance bonuses exceeded my family's entire annual profits. But success came at a personal cost. The demanding schedule left little time for relationships or family visits. When I did manage brief trips home to Millbrook, the conversations were increasingly stilted and uncomfortable. My siblings treated me like a stranger who happened to share their DNA. They made jokes about my corporate speak and my expensive clothes. They questioned whether I was happy living such a superficial lifestyle. They implied that I had traded my soul for money and prestige. "You never ask about the store anymore," Dad observed during one particularly tense dinner. "It's like you don't care what happens to the family business." "Of course I care," I replied, "but I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations. I didn't want to interfere." "Interfere?" Michael laughed bitterly. "You can't interfere with something you abandoned." The accusation that I had abandoned the family business was particularly unfair since they had made it clear from the beginning that my departure meant forfeiture of any role in the store's future. By my third year at McKinsey, I had been promoted to senior associate and was leading client engagements independently. My expertise in retail and small business consulting had made me valuable to the firm and sought after by clients. I had also met David Chen, a fellow consultant who shared my ambition and understood the demands of our profession. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than the small-town familiarity that had characterized my previous romantic experiences. When David proposed during a weekend trip to San Francisco, I was thrilled but also apprehensive about sharing the news with my family. Our engagement represented another step away from the life they had envisioned for me. The phone call to announce my engagement was awkward and painful. "He's not from Nebraska?" Mom asked, as if my fiancé's geographic origin was the most important factor in evaluating him as a potential family member. "He's from California originally," I explained, "but we met in Chicago. He's also a consultant at McKinsey." "Another consultant," Robert said with obvious disdain. "Two people who make their living telling other people how to do their jobs." "We help companies solve complex problems and improve their operations," I corrected, tired of defending my profession to people who refused to understand it. "When's the wedding?" Sarah asked. Will it be here in Millbrook? The question revealed another assumption that would disappoint them. We're planning a ceremony in Chicago, I said. David's family is there and most of our friends are in the city. The silence that followed was heavy with hurt and accusation. So we're not even good enough to host your wedding, Sarah said quietly. It's not about being good enough, I tried to explain. It's about logistics and what makes sense for our situation. But I knew that any explanation would be interpreted as rejection, no matter how diplomatically I phrased it. The wedding, held in a beautiful Chicago venue with 200 guests, was everything David and I had wanted. My parents attended, looking uncomfortable but trying to be supportive. My siblings came but spent most of the reception clustered together, clearly out of place among my professional colleagues and David's extended family. Fancy wedding, Michael observed during one of our few conversations that evening. Must have cost more than most people in Millbrook make in a year. The comment was designed to make me feel guilty about the expense, even though David and I had paid for everything ourselves. We wanted it to be special, I replied diplomatically. Mission accomplished, Sarah said, her tone suggesting that special was not necessarily a compliment. After the wedding, communication with my family dwindled to holiday cards and brief calls on birthdays. The distance between us had become more than geographic. It was emotional and philosophical, rooted in fundamentally different values and life choices. I focused on building my career and my marriage, finding fulfillment in work that challenged me and relationships that supported my ambitions. David and I bought a condominium in downtown Chicago, traveled internationally for both work and pleasure, and began discussing our own plans for starting a family. Meanwhile, snippets of information about Millbrook reached me through Christmas updates and occasional calls from Mom. The hardware store was struggling as big box retailers and online shopping changed consumer behavior. Robert was working longer hours for declining profits. Sarah's husband had lost his job at the grain elevator. Michael's farm equipment sales were down due to agricultural economic pressures. But these updates were presented as information rather than requests for help, and I assumed that my family was managing their challenges the way they always had, through hard work and mutual support. That assumption was shattered by a phone call I received on a Tuesday morning in October, 8 years after I had left Millbrook for college. Amanda? Mom's voice was strained and unfamiliar. We need to talk. Can you come home? It's important. The urgency in her tone immediately had me worried. Is everyone okay? Is Dad sick? We're all healthy, she assured me quickly. But honey, we have some serious problems with the store. We need your help. The irony of the request wasn't lost on me. After years of being told that I had abandoned my family and chosen career over loyalty, they were suddenly asking me to use that same career success to rescue them. What kind of problems? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Financial problems, Mom admitted quietly. Big ones, we might lose the store. The family business that had been more important than my dreams, the sacred obligation that I had supposedly abandoned, was failing. And now, they needed the expertise and resources I had built through the choices they had criticized and resented. I'll catch the next flight to Omaha, I told her. We'll figure this out. But as I hung up the phone and began making travel arrangements, I couldn't help wondering whether my family's sudden need for my help would finally make them understand the value of the path I had chosen, or whether they would resent me even more for being in a position to save them. The 3-hour drive from Omaha to Millbrook gave me time to process the phone call and prepare for what I might find when I arrived. Mom had been vague about the specific nature of their financial problems, but her tone had conveyed genuine desperation. As I drove through the familiar landscape of cornfields and small towns, I reflected on how much had changed since I last made this journey. My rental car was a luxury sedan that cost more per day than many Millbrook residents spent on transportation in a month. My clothes were tailored business attire suitable for client meetings. My phone contained contact information for executives, investment bankers, and business leaders around the world. But I was also the same person who had grown up helping customers find the right screws for their projects and who had learned the value of hard work by sweeping the store's wooden floors after school. The hardware store looked smaller and shabbier than I remembered. The paint was peeling, several windows needed repair, and the parking lot was nearly empty despite being the middle of the business day. A handwritten sign advertised a clearance sale on lawn equipment, suggesting inventory problems. Inside, the store felt hollow and neglected. Shelves that had once been fully stocked were sparsely populated with merchandise. The familiar smell of metal and oil was overpowered by mustiness that suggested poor ventilation and deferred maintenance. Robert was behind the counter, looking older than his 39 years and distinctly uncomfortable when he saw me walk through the door. "Amanda," he said with forced politeness, "thanks for coming." The absence of his usual sarcasm about my corporate appearance told me more about the severity of their situation than any financial statement could have. "Where is everyone?" I asked, noting that the store seemed to be operating with minimal staff. "Dad's at the bank," Robert replied. "Mom's in the office with the accountant. Sarah and Michael should be here soon for the family meeting." The family meeting. I couldn't remember the last time all 4 siblings had been in the same room together, and the fact that they had called one now indicated that their problems were indeed serious. Mom emerged from the back office looking exhausted and relieved to see me. Her embrace was tighter and longer than any hug she had given me since high school graduation. "Oh, honey," she whispered, "I'm so glad you're here. We don't know what to do." The admission was heartbreaking coming from a woman who had always projected strength and competence in managing both family and business affairs. Dad returned from the bank looking defeated, followed shortly by Sarah and Michael. The family gathering was awkward, with years of unresolved tension underlying the current crisis. "So," I said once we were all seated around the small table in the store's break room, "tell me what's happening." The story that emerged was a predictable tale of small business challenges amplified by poor decision-making and denial about changing market conditions. The hardware store had been losing customers steadily for the past 5 years, as residents drove to the new Home Depot 40 minutes away or ordered items online. Instead of adapting their business model, my family had continued operating as if the market conditions were temporary. "We kept thinking things would turn around," Dad explained. "That people would remember the value of personal service and supporting local business." Instead of reducing inventory and overhead costs, they had doubled down on their traditional approach, taking out loans to maintain stock levels and hoping that loyalty would overcome convenience and price advantages. "The debt service is killing us," Robert admitted. "We owe the bank $180,000, plus credit lines with suppliers, plus the mortgage on the building." Sarah's voice was bitter as she added, "We've been working 60-hour weeks just to cover basic expenses. There's no profit left for salaries." Michael had been trying to expand the farm equipment side of the business, but his efforts had been undermined by competition from larger dealers and the ongoing agricultural recession. "I thought I could make up for the hardware losses with equipment sales," he said, "but farmers aren't buying anything they don't absolutely need." The picture they painted was of a business in terminal decline, managed by people who understood customer service and product knowledge, but who lacked the financial and strategic expertise to navigate a changing marketplace. "What do you need from me?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would be both financial and professional. The silence that followed was heavy with the irony of the situation. For 8 years, they had criticized my choice to pursue business expertise instead of staying home to work in the family store. Now that expertise was their only hope for survival. Finally, Dad spoke with obvious difficulty. "We need someone who understands business, finance, and planning. Someone who can help us figure out if this store can be saved, and if so, how." "And if it can't be saved?" I asked. "Then we need help figuring out how to close it without losing everything else we own," Mom said quietly. The admission that they might need to close the family business was devastating for people who had defined themselves through 3 generations of successful operation. "The bank is giving us 90 days to present a viable restructuring plan," Robert explained. "If we can't convince them that the business can be profitable, they'll foreclose on everything." I spent the next 3 days conducting a comprehensive analysis of the store's financial situation and market position. What I found was worse than I had expected, but not hopeless if they were willing to make dramatic changes. The business model that had worked successfully for decades was indeed obsolete, but the store's location and customer relationships still had value that could be leveraged differently. "You can't compete with big-box retailers on price or selection," I explained during our family meeting to review my findings, "but you can offer services and expertise that they can't provide." I outlined a restructuring plan that would reduce the store's footprint by 2/3, eliminate slow-moving inventory categories, and focus on specialized services like equipment repair, custom fabrication, and professional contractor sales. The new model would require about half the current floor space and could operate profitably with 2 full-time employees instead of 4, I continued, but it would mean abandoning the general hardware approach that Grandpa Thomas established. The resistance to change was immediate and emotional. "This store has served this community for 70 years, Robert protested. "We can't just throw away everything Grandpa built." "Grandpa built a successful business by serving his customers' needs," I replied. "Those needs have changed, and the business has to change with them or it will die." Sarah was skeptical about the financial projections. "How can we make the same profit on half the space and inventory?" "You can't make the same profit," I said bluntly. "But you can make a sustainable profit that supports the family without the crushing debt load you're carrying now." The plan I presented would require them to acknowledge that their traditional approach had failed and embrace a more specialized, service-focused strategy. It was a blow to their pride but potentially their salvation. Michael asked the question I had been dreading. "What would this restructuring cost? We don't have money to invest in changes." "The restructuring itself would be relatively inexpensive," I explained. "Most of the changes involve reducing rather than expanding, but you would need capital to cover operating expenses during the transition and to pay down some of the existing debt." "How much capital?" Dad asked. "About 200,000 to implement the plan safely and give yourselves a cushion for the first year of operation." The sum was substantial for a family that was struggling to meet payroll, but it was manageable compared to their total debt burden. "Where would we get that kind of money?" Mom asked. The question hung in the air as everyone looked at me expectantly. They didn't have to say explicitly what they were thinking. I was their only family member with access to that level of capital. David and I had been financially successful beyond my childhood dreams. Our combined income from consulting work, plus bonuses and investment returns, had allowed us to accumulate substantial savings. 200,000 represented a significant sum for us, but not one that would jeopardize our financial security. But lending money to family, especially family that had spent years resenting my success, was complicated by emotional and relationship dynamics that went far beyond financial considerations. "I would need to discuss this with David," I said carefully. "This isn't the kind of decision I can make unilaterally." "Of course," Dad said quickly. "We understand. Take whatever time you need." But I could see the disappointment in their faces. They had hoped for an immediate commitment that would solve their problems without further uncertainty. That evening, I called David from my childhood bedroom to explain the situation and discuss our options. "It sounds like a reasonable business plan," he said after I outlined my analysis and recommendations. "The question is whether you want to become financially involved with your family given your complicated history." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected I knew his concerns. "I mean that lending money to family members changes the relationship dynamic," he explained, "especially when there are existing tensions about success and priorities." David's perspective was informed by his own experience with family financial dynamics, and his caution was well-founded. "If the business fails despite your investment, will they blame you for not providing enough support?" he continued. "And if it succeeds, will they give you credit for saving it, or will they resent being dependent on your help?" His questions forced me to confront the psychological complexity of the situation. My family's request for help was an implicit acknowledgement that my career choices had been correct, but it was also potentially a setup for future resentment. "There's also the practical question of structure," David added. "Is this a gift, a loan, or an investment? Each option has different implications for taxes, family dynamics, and your own financial planning." We talked for over an hour, exploring the various ways to approach the situation and considering the potential consequences of each option. Finally, David offered his perspective. "I think you should help them if you want to help them. But be clear about your expectations and boundaries from the beginning. Don't let guilt or family pressure push you into an arrangement that you'll regret later." The conversation clarified my thinking about the decision I needed to make. I wanted to help save the family business, not just for sentimental reasons, but because I genuinely believed the restructuring plan could work. But I also needed to protect myself from the emotional manipulation and resentment that had characterized my family relationships for years. The next morning, I presented my family with a proposal that addressed both the financial and relational aspects of their request. "David and I are prepared to provide the capital you need," I began, "but it needs to be structured as a business investment rather than a family bailout." I outlined terms that would provide them with the $200,000 they needed while protecting my interests and establishing clear expectations for repayment and involvement. This would be a 5-year loan at market interest rates, secured by the business assets and personal guarantees from Robert and Michael as the primary operators, I explained. I would also require quarterly financial reports and the right to review major business decisions during the loan period. The terms were generous compared to what they could expect from traditional lenders, but they were also structured to ensure that my investment was protected and that the business operated responsibly. Robert's reaction was predictably negative. "So you want to be our boss now? Control how we run the family business?" "I want to protect my investment," I replied calmly. "If you're asking me to risk my money, I need assurance that it's being managed responsibly." Sarah was concerned about the personal guarantees. "What if the business fails anyway? Are you going to come after our houses?" "I hope that won't be necessary," I said. "But yes, if the business fails because of poor management or failure to follow the restructuring plan, I would expect to recover my investment." The room fell silent as my family absorbed the implications of my proposal. They had hoped for unconditional financial rescue. I was offering conditional business investment. Michael finally broke the silence with a question that revealed the core of their discomfort. "What happens to family relationships if we can't pay you back?" It was a fair question that deserved an honest answer. "That depends on why you can't pay me back," I replied. "If the business fails despite good faith efforts to implement the plan, then we'll deal with that situation when it arises. But if it fails because you decide you don't want to make the changes necessary for success, then yes, our family relationships will be affected." Dad spoke up for the first time during the discussion. "Amanda, this is very generous of you, but the terms feel more like what we'd get from a bank than what we'd expect from family." "Dad," I said gently but firmly, "a bank wouldn't lend you this money at all. Your credit is exhausted, your collateral is insufficient, and your business plan is unproven. I'm offering you capital that you can't get anywhere else, at terms that are far better than any commercial lender would provide." "But we're family," Mom said quietly. "Doesn't that count for something?" The question went to the heart of everything that had been wrong with our relationships for the past 8 years. "Yes, we're family," I replied. "That's exactly why I'm willing to risk my money to help you, but being family doesn't mean I should ignore business realities or put my own financial security at risk." I paused, choosing my words carefully for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. "For 8 years you've told me that I was selfish for leaving, that I abandoned my family obligations, that I chose career over loyalty. Now you're asking me to use the success you criticized to save the business you said was more important than my dreams." The room was uncomfortably quiet as the irony of the situation settled over everyone. "I'm willing to help," I continued, "but I'm not willing to pretend that my success was somehow wrong or that your resentment of my choices was justified. If we're going to do this, we need to be honest about what happened and what we're doing now." Robert's face reddened with anger. "So this is about revenge, making us admit we were wrong?" "It's not about revenge," I said calmly. "It's about respect. I want to help save the family business, but I also want my contributions to be acknowledged and valued, not resented." Sarah looked genuinely confused. "Of course we value your help. Why would we resent it?" "Because that's what you've done for 8 years?" I replied. "You've resented my success, my choices, and my refusal to conform to your expectations. I'm concerned that pattern will continue even if I help you now." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Maybe we haven't always been as supportive as we should have been," he admitted. "But family is family. We stick together when it matters." "Family sticks together when it's convenient," I corrected. "Real family sticks together even when it's difficult or when people make choices you don't understand." The conversation was more honest than any we'd had since I left for college, but it was also more painful. Years of accumulated hurt and resentment were finally being acknowledged. Mom tried to find middle ground. "Amanda, we may have been too critical of your choices, but we were hurt that you seemed to be rejecting everything we valued. can't we move past that now? I hope we can, I said, but moving past it requires acknowledging what happened, not pretending it didn't exist. Dad cleared his throat, signaling that he wanted to address the elephant in the room. Amanda, we've made mistakes in how we've treated you. We were scared of losing you, and when you left anyway, we were angry. Maybe we took that anger out on you in ways that weren't fair. It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from him, and it meant more than I had expected. But we need to save this business, he continued. It's not just about money or pride, it's about preserving something that 3 generations of our family built. If you can help us do that, we'll accept whatever terms you think are necessary. The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking, but it was also clarifying. They needed my help badly enough to swallow their pride and acknowledge the value of the expertise they had previously dismissed. All right, I said after a long pause. I'll prepare the loan documentation and we can move forward with the restructuring plan, but I want to be clear about expectations from the beginning. Over the next hour, we worked through the practical details of the arrangement. I would provide $200,000 in working capital, secured by business assets and personal guarantees. The loan would carry a 5% interest rate, payable monthly, with the principal due in 5 years. More importantly, I would serve as an unofficial business advisor during the restructuring period, helping them implement the changes necessary for long-term viability. This isn't just about money, I explained. It's about fundamentally changing how this business operates. That's going to require learning new skills and abandoning some old habits. Robert nodded reluctantly. What kind of changes are we talking about specifically? I pulled out the detailed implementation plan I had prepared. First, you need to reduce your retail footprint by about 60%. The front half of the store should be converted to warehouse space for contractor sales and special orders. The plan called for eliminating entire categories of merchandise that couldn't compete with big box pricing while expanding services that leveraged their expertise and customer relationships. Second, you need to invest in technology that big stores can't provide. Point-of-sale systems that track contractor accounts, inventory management that supports special ordering, and customer relationship management that builds on your personal connections. Sarah looked skeptical. That sounds expensive and complicated. It's less expensive than bankruptcy, I replied, and it's less complicated than trying to compete with Home Depot on their terms. The third major change involved staffing and compensation. You're currently operating with 4 people doing jobs that could be handled by 2 if you focus on higher value activities. Robert and Michael should concentrate on contractor sales and equipment service. The retail counter can be staffed part-time by someone less experienced. Michael raised a concern that I had anticipated. What about Mom and Dad? They've been working in this store for decades. Mom and Dad can transition to semi-retirement, I said gently. They've earned it, and the new business model doesn't require as much hands-on management. The suggestion was diplomatically phrased, but the reality was that my parents' outdated approach to business management was part of the problem that needed to be solved. How long will this transition take? Dad asked. If we start immediately, you should be operating under the new model within 6 months, I replied. But the real test will be the first year. That's when we'll know whether the plan is working. We spent the rest of the afternoon working through implementation details, timelines, and contingency plans. By evening, we had a comprehensive strategy for saving Clark Hardware, but we also had a much clearer understanding of how dramatically things would have to change. That night, I called David to update him on the day's developments and confirm that we were moving forward with the investment. It sounds like they're finally taking the situation seriously, he observed. How do you feel about the personal dynamics? Better than I expected, I admitted. There's still a lot of unresolved history, but the crisis has forced everyone to be more honest about what's really happening. And you're comfortable with the financial risk? David's question forced me to examine my motivations carefully. Was I making this investment because it was a sound business decision, or because I wanted to prove something to my family? I think the business plan is solid, I said after considering his question. The market for specialized hardware services is actually growing, even as general retail hardware declines. If they can execute the transition successfully, this could be a sustainable business. But, David prompted, sensing my hesitation. But there's definitely an emotional component, I admitted. I want to save the family business, and I want to prove that the expertise they dismissed is actually valuable. Those aren't necessarily bad motivations, David replied. Just be honest with yourself about what you're hoping to achieve. The loan documentation took 2 weeks to prepare and finalize. I worked with a business attorney in Omaha to ensure that all the legal protections were properly structured while keeping the terms as family-friendly as possible. When we signed the papers in the hardware store's back office, the atmosphere was solemn and hopeful. My family was grateful for the lifeline, but they were also apprehensive about the changes ahead. "This is a new beginning for Clark Hardware," Dad said as we shook hands after signing. "We won't let you down." "You won't let yourselves down," I corrected. "This is your business and your future. I'm just providing the capital and advice to make it possible." The implementation of the restructuring plan was more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Reducing inventory meant taking significant write-offs on merchandise that couldn't be sold at cost. Reconfiguring the store layout required physical labor and temporary business disruption. Learning new technology and processes meant admitting that old methods were obsolete. But there were also early signs of success that validated the strategy. Contractors who had been driving to the Home Depot began returning to Clark Hardware for specialized services and knowledgeable advice. The equipment repair business grew as farmers and landscapers discovered that Robert had developed genuine expertise in small engine maintenance. Most importantly, the monthly financial reports showed steady improvement in cash flow and profitability. The dramatic reduction in overhead costs meant that smaller sales volumes could still generate sustainable margins. 6 months into the restructuring, Michael called me with news that surprised everyone. "Amanda, we just landed a contract to be the exclusive supplier for the new housing development west of town," he said, excitement clear in his voice. "The contractor wants someone who can provide specialized hardware and same-day delivery. It's exactly the kind of business your plan was designed to capture." The contract represented the largest single account in the store's history and validated the strategy of focusing on professional customers rather than retail shoppers. "That's fantastic," I replied. "How are you handling the increased volume?" "We hired a part-time delivery driver and expanded our warehouse space into the old retail area," Michael explained. "It's amazing how much more efficiently we can operate when we're not trying to stock everything for everybody." The success was gratifying, but it also revealed how much potential had been wasted by clinging to an outdated business model. A year after implementing the restructuring plan, Clark Hardware was profitable for the first time in 5 years. The loan payments were being made on schedule, the business was growing, and my family had developed confidence in their new approach. More importantly, our relationships had begun to heal in ways that went beyond the immediate business crisis. "Amanda," Sarah said during one of my quarterly visits, "I owe you an apology for how we treated you when you left for college." We were sitting in the store's break room, reviewing financial reports that showed continued improvement in the business metrics. "We were scared that you were rejecting us," she continued. "When you succeeded without us, it felt like proof that we weren't important to you." "You were always important to me," I replied, "but I needed to discover what I was capable of on my own." "I think we understand that now," Sarah said. "Watching you save our business has shown us what your education and experience are really worth." The acknowledgement meant more to me than any financial return on my investment. Robert had undergone perhaps the most dramatic change in perspective. The brother who had once dismissed my corporate career as telling other people how to do their jobs had become an eager student of business management principles. "I've been reading those books you recommended," he told me during my most recent visit. "The stuff about customer segmentation and value propositions makes a lot more sense now that I'm actually applying it." "Business theory is only useful when it solves real problems," I replied. "You're seeing results because you're implementing the concepts intelligently." The conversation would have been impossible 2 years earlier, when Robert viewed my business education as pretentious credentialism. Michael had embraced the equipment service side of the business with enthusiasm that surprised everyone. His natural mechanical aptitude, combined with formal training I had arranged, had made him the region's most sought-after small engine specialist. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted during one family dinner, "but I'm having more fun running this business than I ever did trying to compete with the big stores." "You're playing to your strengths instead of trying to match someone else's advantages," I observed. "That's always more sustainable and more satisfying." Even my parents had adapted to the changes with grace and optimism. Dad's transition to semi-retirement had been difficult initially, but he had discovered satisfaction in mentoring Robert and Michael rather than trying to control every aspect of the operation. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you kids have accomplished," he told me during my most recent visit home. "You saved something important, but you also made it better than it was before." Mom had found new purpose in managing the business's community relationships and marketing efforts. Her natural social skills and deep local knowledge made her invaluable for building the customer loyalty that was central to the new business model. "We should have listened to you sooner," she said as we walked through the transformed store. "Not just about the business changes, but about your career choices. You were right to pursue your own path." The admission was validation I had wanted for years, but it came with the wisdom to appreciate it without needing it for my own sense of worth. 2 years after providing the loan that saved Clark Hardware, I received the first principal payment, delivered personally by Robert during a visit to Chicago. "The business is doing well enough that we could pay this off early if you want," he said as he handed me the check. "We're actually thinking about expanding the equipment service side and maybe adding a second location." The transformation from a failing retail store to a growing service business had exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. "Keep the money and reinvest it in growth," I advised. "The loan terms were designed to give you flexibility, not to maximize my returns." "Are you sure?" Robert asked. "You took a big risk helping us. You should benefit from the success." "I am benefiting," I replied. "Our family relationships are healthier than they've been in years, and you've built something sustainable that honors Grandpa Thomas's legacy. That's worth more than financial returns." The conversation represented a complete reversal from the resentment and suspicion that had characterized our relationship for so many years. 3 years after the restructuring, Clark Hardware had become a regional success story, featured in trade publications as an example of how small businesses could adapt to changing market conditions. Michael's equipment service had grown into a separate profit center. Robert's contractor sales had expanded to include 3 neighboring counties. The business was not just surviving but thriving. More personally significant was the invitation I received to be the keynote speaker at the Nebraska Small Business Association's annual conference. "We want someone who understands both small business challenges and corporate solutions," the program director explained. "Your work with Clark Hardware has become a model for rural business adaptation." The speech I gave, titled "Coming Home: Using Corporate Experience to Strengthen Family Businesses," was based on lessons learned from my family's journey through crisis and recovery. "Success isn't about rejecting your roots," I told the audience of small business owners. "It's about using whatever skills and knowledge you've acquired to strengthen the communities and relationships that matter most to you." The response was overwhelmingly positive, and several attendees approached me afterward about consulting opportunities with their own businesses. But the most meaningful feedback came from my family, who had attended the conference to support my presentation. "I never thought I'd say this," Dad said as we celebrated afterward, "but I'm proud of how you left Millbrook and I'm proud of how you came back." The distinction he made was important. He was acknowledging that my departure had been necessary for my development, while also recognizing that my return on my own terms and with valuable expertise had benefited everyone. Today, 5 years after that desperate phone call that brought me home to face my family's crisis, Clark Hardware continues to grow and evolve. The loan has been fully repaid ahead of schedule, and the business generates enough profit to support 2 families comfortably while funding continued expansion. More importantly, my relationships with my siblings have been transformed by our shared experience of crisis and recovery. We still have different perspectives and life choices, but we also have mutual respect and genuine affection that had been missing for too many years. I've established a consulting practice that specializes in helping family businesses navigate generational transitions and market adaptations. The work allows me to split my time between Chicago and rural areas, maintaining my professional development while staying connected to the communities that shaped my values. David and I recently purchased a lake house about an hour from Millbrook, giving us a retreat that's close enough for regular family visits but far enough away to maintain our independence. We've started talking seriously about having children, and the prospect of raising them with connections to both urban opportunities and rural values feels like the best of both worlds. The journey from the young woman who left Millbrook with hurt feelings and big dreams to the established professional who returned with resources and expertise has taught me that success isn't about choosing between family and family, career, tradition and innovation, or loyalty and independence. Real success is about developing the skills and confidence to contribute meaningfully to the people and places you care about, even when that contribution looks different than what others expected. My siblings had called me selfish for leaving, and in some ways, they were right. I was prioritizing my own development and opportunities over their immediate needs and expectations. But that selfish pursuit of education and experience ultimately enabled me to help them in ways that would have been impossible if I had stayed and followed their original plan for my life. The irony is that by leaving Millbrook, I gained the knowledge and resources that allowed me to save what was most valuable about staying. By pursuing my own definition of success, I became capable of preserving the family legacy that my siblings thought I was abandoning. The hardware store that my grandfather built in 1952 is still serving the community in 2024, but it's serving them better because it adapted to changing conditions rather than clinging to outdated methods. The family business that nearly died from stubbornness and pride was saved by embracing new ideas and acknowledging the value of expertise gained through different experiences. And the family relationships that were nearly destroyed by resentment and misunderstanding were ultimately strengthened by crisis that forced everyone to reassess their assumptions and priorities. So what about you? Have you ever felt torn between family expectations and personal ambitions? How did you handle pressure to conform to others' definitions of loyalty and success? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path while honoring your roots. Remember, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is to develop yourself fully, even if that development takes you away from them temporarily. The skills, knowledge, and confidence you gain through pursuing your own dreams might be exactly what they need when their own dreams are threatened. And remember that coming home doesn't have to mean going backward. It can mean bringing forward the best of what you've learned to strengthen what was always worth preserving. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, success isn't about choosing between family and individual achievement, it's about finding ways to honor both.